Good evening. I'm Courtney McNeil, Chief Curator and Deputy Director for Curatorial Affairs, and on behalf of Telfair Museums and our Board Chair, Ted Kleisner, it is my great honor to welcome you this evening to celebrate the opening of Monet to Matisse, Masterworks of French Impressionism from the Dixon Gallery and Gardens. I should warn you that mobile phones that ring during our esteemed guest lecture will promptly be confiscated by museum staff and then sold off at our next fundraiser. So if you don't like the idea of contributing to the museum in that way, I would ask you to take a moment now and silence your phones. And after the lecture, I hope you'll all remember to enjoy, across the street we have a wonderful reception with a French theme, as well as the galleries upstairs containing the wonderful exhibition that we're here tonight to celebrate. So in all of the excitement surrounding the opening of this landmark exhibition, I want to take a moment to remember why we are here. We're here because of you, the members of Telfair Museums. Your support allows us to continue to serve this community as we have done for 132 years and counting, bringing to Savannah exciting exhibitions showcasing the work of artists past and present. You, our members, act as our ambassadors in the community, telling your friends about the unique programs and exhibitions that Telfair is so proud to offer. And clearly you're doing a great job based on the sellout crowd of over 400 people who've gathered here tonight, so thank you for that as well. 1886. To explain why Monet to Matisse is so significant to Telfair Museums, I want to take you to the year 1886. That year in Paris, a group of free-thinking and independent artists who rebelled against the deeply held traditions of the French art world gathered together to put on what would be their last official group exhibition. They had put on a total of 8 independent exhibitions starting in 1874, and by the time their final show rolled around in 1886, they had forever changed the landscape of the art world. You've probably heard of them. We call them the Impressionists. Also in 1886, the American South got its very first public art museum when the Telfair Academy of Arts and Sciences opened its doors to the public. While our founding collection does not contain, sadly, the work of the very avant-garde French Impressionists, many of the most significant and beloved works in our permanent collection are by the American Impressionists, who adopted this radical new style of painting and brought it to the bustling cities and majestic landscapes of the United States. So I hope you will visit Monet to Matisse, and in the following weeks, stop by the Telfair Academy so to appreciate with fresh eyes the tremendous influence of the French Impressionists on an entire generation of American artists who would follow them. Before I introduce tonight's guest speaker, I'd like to thank those who helped bring this exhibition from the Dixon Gallery in Memphis here to Savannah. Major support for this exhibition is provided by SunTrust Bank, Georgia Ports Authority, Georgia Power, Savannah Airport Commission, and Visit Savannah. Investment is also provided by the City of Savannah and the Georgia Council for the Arts. Thank you to our Directors Circle Council members for their annual exhibition support, and to our many individual donors who supported this exhibition. I'd like to also offer a very special thanks to the Telfair Academy Guild for underwriting tonight's members-only opening lecture and reception. And we thank our friends here at Trinity United Methodist Church for allowing us to gather here in their beautiful sanctuary. And of course, I thank my hugely talented colleagues here at Telfair Museums from all departments across the institution who worked on exhibition design, educational programs, the marketing plan, fundraising, and all the other aspects that are necessary to bring a major project like this to fruition. And of course, the greatest thanks are owed to our colleagues at the Dixon Gallery, including Board Chair C. Penn Owen III and his wife Gwen Owen, who I'm so pleased are able to join us here tonight, and of course, the director of the Dixon Gallery, Kevin Sharp, our featured speaker. We're so glad that they generously loaned these 30 masterworks of French Impressionist and Post-impressionist painting to the Telfair and allowed us to share them with the thousands of visitors who will cross the threshold of the Jepson Center from now through February 10th. Now to introduce our speaker. Kevin Sharp is the Linda W. and S. Herbert Rea Director of the Dixon Gallery and Gardens in Memphis, a position he's held since 2007. Prior to coming to the Dixon, he was Director of Visual Arts at Cedarhurst in Mount Vernon, Illinois, Curator of American Art at the Norton Museum of Art in West Palm Beach, Florida, and Research Curator at the Art Institute of Chicago. He has organized or co-organized more than 50 exhibitions in his career, including international retrospectives of the work of Odilon Redon, Mary Cassatt, and Jean-Louis Ferrin, for which he also wrote the catalogs. He was a contributing author to such books as The Lithographs of James McNeill Whistler, Whistler's Mother, an American Icon, and Cecilia Beau, American Figure Painter. He's also the sole author of many publications, including A Wilder Image Bright, Hudson River School paintings from the Manoogian collection, Bold, Cautious, True, Walt Whitman and the American Art of the Civil War, and many others. Kevin is a wonderful, knowledgeable, and very engaging speaker, and I'm so pleased to welcome him here tonight. We're all in for a real treat. So please join me in welcoming Kevin Sharp.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Courtney, and thank you to the. Am I bellowing? By the way, I have a tendency. Well, what I really have is a big mouth. So, if I get too noisy, you just say the word. When they found out back in Memphis that I was going to be speaking from a pulpit, there were any number of bets going on about the likelihood of lightning strikes. So any of you in the front row, you may want to just be prepared. Anything could happen. Yeah, it's great to be back in Savannah. This is a very special community, and the Telfair is a wonderful, wonderful museum of fine art. As Courtney said, I arrived at the Dixon in 2007, and one of my first goals was to try to build relationships with institutions across the country and around the world if I could, but also to make connections to other institutions in the Southeast region. And I'd been to Savannah many times. Like I said, I'm a fan of your city, and so the Telfair was high on my list of organizations that I really wanted to try to partner with, and so I'm so pleased that it's finally happening by bringing Monet to Matisse to the Telfair Museum. Now, the Dixon circulates its collection as an exhibition really very rarely. We do it because we think it brings value to the Dixon as an institution that organizes and circulates shows. We think it shows a certain kind of leadership, but we also do it, to help to find great partners in the future. And I think that's what we've done here. How did the Impressionist Revolution begin? Well, it's a very complicated question. I will say this: it really is a revolution. When Impressionism emerges in Paris in the 1860s, and then more vigorously in the 1870s and beyond, it really changed everything. Nothing was quite the way it had been before, and so, this isn't speaker hyperbole when I call this thing a revolution. It truly was. Nothing was like it had been before. I would say that there were any number of things that caused this revolution, but I could think of 5 major events that really created this shift, or led to this shift. I would say the first one was the French academic system itself, and the exhibition program in the city of Paris. There was this entity called the Salon in Paris. So every year, thousands and thousands of artists would submit work to the annual Salon, and it would be held sometimes in the Palais des Champs-Élysées, sometimes in the Palace of Industry, sometimes in other giant buildings. And these were huge and successful events. People came out in great number to see these shows. but it had a way of, the French academic system had a way in the 1840s, 50s, 60s, leading up to the Impressionist generation, of absolutely quelling anything that was not in their model of art making. There was no room for real innovation within the French academic system at that time. And so this building that would hold thousands, sometimes as many as 4,000 or 5,000 works of art, all of those works of art would look roughly the same. And they'd embrace different subjects, different themes, they would be different sizes, they'd be certainly of different levels of quality, but there was a sameness that was very much intentional, and the Impressionist generation represented a first major breach in that system. The other thing that happens in that I think contributes to the rise of Impressionism is the invention of photography. Photography is invented, or daguerreotypes, or whatever you want to call the very first photographic processes. They begin, that starts at almost exactly the same time as the Impressionist generation is born. And so I'm showing you a photograph, a self-staged photograph of the French photographer Nadar, who was also a bit of a promoter but certainly the best-known photographer in Paris in the 1850s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. Anybody who was anybody was photographed by, if they had their photograph made, they were photographed by Nadar. He was also famous for going up in a hot air balloon and taking photographs looking down of the city of Paris. And so here, in a bit of self-promotion, he's showing himself in a hot air balloon. But that kind of realism that photography is the very essence of photography has an impact on the Impressionist aesthetic, to be sure. The other thing that happens is the absolute influx of Japanese art into the city of Paris starting in the 1850s. Tokyo Bay is opened up in 1854, I think. In 1854, and suddenly this incredibly closed society and its utterly brilliant aesthetic is accessible to everyone. And I mean, at one time I knew all the statistics on the sheer volume of lacquerware, folding screens, Japanese prints, ceramic that were imported into Paris on every single day of the year. But I don't remember it anymore. But it's a lot. Let me tell you, it's a lot. And the French were absolutely crazy for it. They were wild for it, and nobody was wilder for it than French vanguard artists. So that is your third major contributor. And then a fourth was the rise of the Barbizon school. This was really the first school of painting to embrace landscape and plein air painting in the open air, painting directly in front of your subject, your landscape subject, as opposed to going back in your studio and producing something more controlled. And that had a tremendous influence on the Impressionist generation. And this it's funny to see this painting so large because it's really about this big, and utterly charming. But at least you can see it really well. And it's a painting by Camille Corot from about 1830. So we're talking a good 40 years before the Impressionist experiment really takes hold. But it's a valuable work for the Impressionist story. I mean, what you're looking at is a road paver repairing the Chailly Road, which leads from Paris to the city of Fontainebleau, near the Barbizon forest, for which the Barbizon school is named. So what this little man in his red vest and his pile of cobblestones is actually doing is paving the road to Impressionism. It's, yeah. When you think about it that way, it all starts. So anyway, I'm very happy that it was part of the that Courtney chose it to be part of the exhibition because it really is a marvelous setup. And of course, so much of the Impressionist aesthetic is invested in landscape painting as well. The other thing, and this is number 5, and to me, this is the real. I mean, I think this is the one that maybe that's talked about the least, but maybe has the most influence on the rise of something as innovative as the Impressionist experiment, and that is the rebuilding of the city of Paris. So just a little bit of rewind and backstory. Napoleon III, who's the nephew or the great nephew of Napoleon I, the Napoleon we all know. Napoleon III had lived in exile his entire life, and in 1851 he comes back to Paris and is elected president. And he's a Bonaparte, he's a Napoleon. So 2 years after that, he stages a coup and names himself emperor and takes over, founds the Second Empire in Paris. And on some levels, he's wildly successful. He launches into an urban renewal project in the city of Paris like nothing that had ever been done before anywhere in the world. So the Paris if you've seen Paris or seen photographs of Paris, the Paris today was basically created by Napoleon III. He hires the prefect of the Seine, a man named Baron Haussmann, to renovate the entire city. So all of those broad boulevards, all of those, those beautiful mansard roofs on the buildings, the fact that you stand in any given place in the city of Paris and look around and all the windows line up, that kind of French affection for order is all there because of Baron Haussmann and Napoleon III. But here's what you're really talking about, okay? You're basically talking about the city of Paris being under massive renovation for a good 17 years. Everything changes. Now just imagine if I told you your house was going to be under renovation for 17 years. I mean, might disrupt things a little bit, mightn't it? And so then the only reason the renovations in Paris stop in 1870 is because France enters the Franco-Prussian War, which turns out to be a disaster for France. The whole time, Napoleon III is making Paris so wonderful with these beautiful buildings and these beautiful vistas and these wide boulevards. The one thing he's not doing is building a really good army. And so, and Berlin, kind of looked like Berlin always had, but the Prussians were building a great army. And so when Napoleon III picks a fight with the Prussians, he lost it pretty quick. And the people that really lost were the Parisian people. The siege of Paris was long and brutal and just a terrible, terrible thing. And when it ended, there was a sort of provisional socialist government takes over, and they're going to make things better for all the people of France. Well, the French military comes back in and has just enough strength to suppress that commune. And of course, there's just massive destruction. So on the screen, you're looking at the Avenue d'Opera in its most beautiful phase, and on the screen on your right, you're seeing the Palace of the Tuileries after the suppression of the commune and its destruction. So I think all of this, the Franco-Prussian War, the commune, all of these things happen when the Impressionists are, for the most part, in their 20s and 30s. They're young artists. They're building a future. They're thinking about what their work is going to mean. And so I think all of these things put together really contributed to the rise of Impressionism in Paris. The work on the screen is our marvelous early Monet painting. So this is Monet working in. We're almost certain this is the year 1870. We know for a fact he's painting in the village of Trouville on the Normandy coast. You're actually seeing a little slip of the English Channel right here, or La Manche, as the French call it, the sleeve. And smart money says he is on his way. He may have painted this on his way to England, where he will wait out the Franco-Prussian War. He wasn't the only French artist to do so. Camille Pissarro goes as well. Daubigny goes as well. I mean, they were truly the wise ones to leave Paris before this thing starts. Plus, Monet had already done his military service. He'd done it in the 1860s, and he was not inclined to do it again. So once again, look at what he's representing. It's the road, and now this is 40 years after Corot, and we're definitely on the road to Impressionism now. I mean, he's still finding his way as an artist, but it's a absolutely marvelous early work, and that's one of the things you'll see in our exhibition. Is we have a lot of work in the early phase of the Impressionist experiment. So Monet's gone in 1870, 1871, 1872. He starts making his way back through Holland. You know, he's looking at all the Dutch masters and all that great stuff, and going to the Rijksmuseum and visiting the canals, and the body of work that he makes there is incredibly beautiful as well. And then he returns to Paris in 72, 73. And, you know, I mean, one of the things you need if you're going to start a revolution is a little bit of organization. And it's nice to think of the Impressionists as these like-minded artists who are trying to stamp out the suppression of the French academic system, but it's not quite like that. And so the fact that any group of artists as large as the Impressionist circle could get together and be on the same page about anything is kind of an impossibility in its own right, but they did it. And so in 1874, about 25, 30 artists band together. They rent Nadar's studio right there at the where is it? 35 Boulevard de Capucine. It's still there in Paris. You can go see it today. They rent Nadar's studio, the most famous photographer in the city of Paris, and they stage they call themselves the Société Anonyme, the Anonymous Society, just what it sounds like. And boy, were they. They were a completely unknown quantity. But here's the thing I've always found interesting about this is the title page of the first Impressionist exhibition that was held in 1874. It is that they called it the Première Exposition, meaning the first exhibition, as if there was going to be a second and a third and a fourth, and there was. Now the show is in, like I said, it's in the studio of this very famous photographer, a well-known person. At this time, in 1874, there were probably 100 newspapers in the city of Paris. So, and there were lots and lots and lots of art writers in the city of Paris. And so they come out to see this show that's taking place in Nadar's studio, that these artists have the temerity to stage at the very same time as the annual salon. I mean, they couldn't have been any more bold or confident. And the critics come out to see it, and there are literally 50 reviews, at least 50 reviews of this very first show. And they are, while the works of art in the exhibition were varied and different, the reviews were almost all identical. And they all said, these artists are terrible. They can't draw, they're not trained, they are showing us sketches, they're little daubs, these are just the worst pictures I've ever been exposed to. It's basically the end of civilization as we know it. And those were the kind of positive ones. But it's actually the best thing that could have happened to them. because you know what it did? Created notoriety. You know, I mean, everybody, you couldn't miss these reviews. There were too many of them. And so they went from being a société anonyme to being a société kind of notorious. And that actually helps. And one of the works that Monet shows in that first exhibition is a painting called Impression Sunrise. Now, this is not Impression Sunrise. This is our painting from several years later, but it kind of looks like a sunrise. And it's a theme that will filter through Monet's work in any number of different works. This is actually a sunset. We kind of know that. But Impression Sunrise catches the attention of a critic named Louis Leroy, who just can't get over the word impression. Yeah, these aren't paintings, they're just impressions. You know, they're just glimpses, they're not complete works. And so that is how, in 1874, the Impressionists become the Impressionists. This is a marvelous painting, by the way. It's actually painted in 1882. I've told this story a couple of times already, but some of you haven't heard it, I guess. Monet does one of my favorite things in the whole history of art. I mean, aside from his painting, he does. It's so absolutely beautifully stupid. I can't even believe he really did it. In the 1870s, he's maybe got one patron, maybe one person who's actually supporting him, buying his paintings, somebody that he can borrow money from, and he does all the time. I mean, it's however poor you've ever been in your life, the Impressionists were 100 times poorer. I mean, they struggled, and Monet struggled mightily. And so he has this one guy, a man named Ernest Hocheday. And, he goes to Hocheday, buys his work, he loans him money, he's a successful guy. And he goes back to him all the time. And he gets to know him really well. And then he also gets to know his wife really well. And yeah, he winds up stealing his one patron's wife. I mean, it's just, and well, there goes that patronage. And so not only does he steal Hocheday's wife, he gets to raise Hocheday's 6 children. And so there, at this moment in 1882 is exactly when it happens. It actually happened. This is probably February of 1882. I mean, doesn't the port look kind of icy? Anyway, it's Monet is experiencing what this basically blended family. He'd been married earlier in his life, and his wife had died, and so he was raising one child. But suddenly he's in a house with 7 children in it, and he does what any innovative and resourceful artist will do, is he leaves town on a painting trip and leaves all the kids with Blanche Hocheday. So anyway, and we know all this because the one thing he does do is he writes to her every day, and that correspondence has been preserved. And so we know exactly where he was when he painted this picture. We know exactly where he was on the port of Dieppe because he puts it in his letters home. So this is just, like I said, this is a way into a couple of things about Monet, the name of the Impressionists, and all, and his development a few years later. It's just a marvelous painting. And so there were, the Impressionist experiment was very much dominated. The early shows were dominated by the landscape painters, and we have good representation in the show of those artists. And this is our little painting by Alfred Seasley. There are actually 2 in the show. I like Seasley a lot. He doesn't get as much play as Monet or Renoir, but he's good. He's really good. And what you're looking at right here is the Pont de Sèvres, the bridge to the town of Sèvres, where they make the porcelain in Paris. And whereas Monet if Monet was painting the Seine, you'd probably see pleasure boats and that kind of thing out in the water. You just barely see the water here, and it's icy and it's cold, and you see a working man walking along the quay, headed to his job. That is Alfred Seasley, and I kind of like him for it. The other artist who was very much invested in landscape and seascape painting at this same time and in the early Impressionist exhibition showed that work is Pierre-Auguste Renoir. And this is our beautiful Renoir painting, The Wave. It was painted in 1882, again the same year that Monet's painting was painted, and it's also painted on the Normandy coast. But Renoir is in 1881 and 1882, he goes to Wargamont on the Normandy coast and stays with his one patron, his good friend Paul Bérard. Now he's smart enough not to steal Bérard's wife, but he's just trying to get out of the city. You know, it's summer, Paris is hot, it's uncomfortable. You know, it's smelly, you know, it's just not a place you want to be in 1882 when you could be on the Normandy coast, which is delightful. And so he spends the whole summer with Bérard twice. And in exchange for room and board for the summer, he paints all the Bérard children. And you know, you can look it up. I mean, these paintings are terrible. This is either that or the Bérard children were the ugliest French children that ever lived. You know, but I don't think so. I think Renoir is just trying to, you know, do what he needs to do to have a nice summer vacation. What he really wants to do is paint the Normandy coast, and he does it brilliantly. This painting is a masterpiece, and the sea is roiling here, and when you stand in front of this painting, you know, the impasto on the surface of this canvas is absolutely churning as well. He works it with a palette knife, and that knife is spinning, and every time that palette knife leaves the surface of the canvas and leaves the surface of that paint, you know, it creates this little line of paint that forms into a tiny little point. And if you look at this thing really carefully, if you get so close to this painting, the guards come and tell you to step back from it, as I always do. You know, you'll see that all of those points of paint are still intact. This painting is immaculate. It's perfect. And you get to live with it for the next few months, unless I decide to take it back with me, which I'm seriously considering. It's just such a good, and it just throws all the conventions of seascape painting into the wind. I mean, all seascape painters always give you a little bit of beach to stand on. Renoir puts you right in the water. You're right in the water. I mean, your feet are definitely wet. It's just a magical painting. And he paints, there's probably a half a dozen of these at least that are out there. It's one of the strongest bodies of work in his entire career, in my opinion. And we are very fortunate to have this. This painting is one of the most frequently requested from the Dixon collection. The first 2 years I worked at the Dixon, poor me, I never laid eyes on the painting because it was in the Renoir landscape show, and then it went to another exhibition which I now can't remember, so I probably shouldn't have gone there, or I would remember it. So anyway, it's just a marvelous thing. And so there were these group of landscape painters who were part of this impressionist experiment, but there were also figure painters like Edgar Degas. And Degas was beginning by 1874, 76 when the second show took place, 77, 79 when the fourth show took place, 80, 81, 82. These shows, you know, he was really beginning to get some traction with his ballet subjects, even though they're complicated. And I mean, they're sometimes otherworldly beautiful, and sometimes they're just absolutely the opposite. Degas had this great love of dance, but he also had this kind of complicated relationship with the ballerinas because, you know, Degas was of a certain social class, and French ballerinas were, I mean, don't imagine your children or your grandchildren in little tutus and how cute they look. These kids were, you know, sometimes the sole support of their whole family. I mean, they were considered, I mean, they were just a notch above street rats, you know, in the public consciousness. And so, you know, Degas would often paint them in that way. I mean, this is a marvelous thing, and the uplighting is just so real and so effective. But I mean, if you look at her face very carefully, she's almost grotesque in a way. But this is Degas. This is, this brilliant, complicated painter all his own. And Degas becomes one of the leaders of the Impressionist movement, and he begins to bring other artists in who are kind of similar to himself, who are in his circle. And Degas begins to make rules for the Impressionists. Like the big one was, if you show with us, you don't show at the salon. You absolutely are forbidden to show at the salon. And of course, Renoir, it's like, why would I do that? Why would I agree to that? I mean, if I get a painting in the salon, I might sell it, I might make some money, And so Renoir, Degas takes a larger presence in the Impressionist circle. Renoir and Monet actually stopped showing in 1880 and 81, I believe. But that's all right, because Degas has brought in his own circle, including Jean-Francois Raffaelli, who painted this wonderful, wonderful painting of the Place d'Italie from about 1877. And it's this marvelous subject, After the Rain. It's May of 1877, and I know that not because I'm so smart, but because Raffaelli wrote it right here. And this is a little glimpse of the Paris I was talking about that was under renovation for so long. Look, my favorite thing in this painting, sand pile, right here. And look here, they're excavating. It just went on and on and on. If you were born in 1853, by the time you were 17 years old, you still would never have come out from under scaffolding. It's just impossible to describe how pervasive this project was. So Raffaelli joins the Impressionist circle. So does Mary Cassatt. Mary Cassatt becomes an incredibly devoted, she's not a pupil, but a very devoted colleague to Degas. This is a portrait of Mary Cassatt's sister Lydia. It's a marvelous thing. This is Stanislas Lapine. This is a view of the island of the Grand Jatte, which was a favorite bathing place for Parisians. It was just outside the city of Paris. It was an island in the Seine, and it was the very same place that Georges Seurat painted the famous painting of the Grand Jatte that's in, all the little dots, the pointillist painting that is in the Art Institute of Chicago. Anybody heard of Stanislas Lapine? Yeah, he's probably the best painter I know that nobody's ever heard of. It's a marvelous thing. And he takes part in these Impressionist shows. And then Henri Rouart, and this is also in the exhibition. This is a portrait of his daughter playing the guitar, and she's actually in their home. And Rouart was Degas' great friend, had known Degas, they were children together. And Rouart's painting, being a painter, was his second job. He was really good at it, and he takes part in 7 of the 8 Impressionist shows, I think. But he's made a fortune in I think, I'm trying to remember. He's either in textiles or refrigeration. I think it was early refrigeration, and he was a very rich man. So in addition to making very competent Impressionist paintings like this one, he also bought Impressionist pictures. So look at all the picture frames in the background. He'd wind up forming one of the largest collections of Impressionist paintings anywhere. And the sale of his collection when he dies in 1913 is, the dealers are scrambling for the work by then. So Rouart is part of this circle as well. But none of it would have mattered if it weren't for this man. Anybody know? You know who we're looking at. We're looking at Paul Durand-Ruel. Anybody know who he is? He's all of their dealer. He's the only commercial agent in Paris who really has any interest at all in the Impressionists, and he changes the narrative. In about 1882, now he had known the Impressionist painters for more than a decade at this point. When Monet and Pissarro go to London to wait out the Franco-Prussian War, Durand-Ruel is there. He knows them, but he has zero interest in representing them at that point. But about 1882, because he's making a fortune selling Barbizon paintings by artists like Camille Corot, the first painting I showed you. So he just simply doesn't need them. But by 1882, the Barbizon market is beginning to dry up. He needs some new talent, and he takes a chance on the Impressionists. And I guarantee you, you would have no idea who Claude Monet was if it weren't for this man. And in addition to being a very effective commercial agent, dealer for this work, he also opens an outpost in New York in 1886. And so if you've ever wondered why there are so many French Impressionist paintings in the United States, and I'm convinced there's as many here as there are in France, it's because of him. Again, it's because of him. So just a very important character in this story. So he also, and he gives them shows. He gives them exhibitions, begrudgingly, but he gives them. And so a whole nother generation, a younger generation of painters become familiar with the Impressionist aesthetic because they're seeing it most frequently, not in the studios of the artist, to which they're rarely invited, but in the gallery of Paul Durand-Ruel, including this painting, one of my favorites in the collection. I spent a lot of time as a curator of American art. And every American curator claims John Singer Sargent as an American artist, even though he's born in Italy and doesn't set foot in the United States until he's 24 years old. But, that's a technicality, But this is just a marvelous thing. This is a portrait of his good friend. This is Sargent painting when he's 24 years old, basically. So he was actually 22 when he first gets to the United States. He's 24 years old. He's painting his good friend Ramon Subercaseaux, who's a Chilean diplomat. They're seated, obviously, in a gondola in Venice, and so in this moment, and I love this painting because when you're standing in front of it, and even as you're sitting in front of it, out in the audience here, you really get to be a surrogate for John Singer Sargent. You are seated on the other at the other end of this gondola with Ramon Subercaseaux, and he's painting you while you're painting him. There's this back and forth that is just so incredibly smart, and because you're Sargent, you're preternaturally able to make paint do whatever you want it to on the surface of the canvas, and Sargent can do that, and he's captured this. What he's captured is the glance. As you're making your portrait of him, you're looking down at what you're painting, and you're looking up to see what he really looks like, down and up. And Sargent has caught that glimpse, that quick look, and it's so incredibly effective. And we have, for years, we've looked for this little painting here on the lap, because he's painting Sargent right back. And the light coming through the canvas on the gondola is just, it's rapidly executed, but brilliantly executed. And, he's just a cute little guy with his mustache and his derby hat and the buttons on his shoes. It's all so good, and it's not even the best part of the painting. The best part of the painting is over here, where he's painted, in about, I guarantee you, no more than 10 minutes, he has captured and effectively captured the look of a Venetian canal, and the light falling on the side of the palazzo, and two gondolas moored to the side of this palazzo, and a woman right here going up the steps to the bridge. It's lightning fast and lightning real. It's just an incredible thing. And then, you also have the next generation begins to emerge. We also own this really choice. Toulouse-Lautrec painted this picture when he was 20 years old, and obviously he's looking at the work of Edgar Degas, right? People, Toulouse-Lautrec gets a lot of notice right out of the gate, and he's painting these backstage subjects of ballerinas in green rooms, and they're really good. And someone asked Degas, if he know, do you know Toulouse-Lautrec? Do you know Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec? And he says, sure, I know him. He's the guy who paints with his hands in my pockets. So it's hard. I can never look at this painting without thinking of that. And then we also own this. I mean, this painting is literally this big, but it's just so choice. This is George Seurat, and this is actually a study for the Grand Jatte. And at this point, this is the next generation of Impressionists, or the next generation of Post-impressionists, really, who are taking all the innovation of the Impressionist aesthetic and turning it into something else entirely. And so while many artists, many of the Impressionists were known for working in the outdoors and painting from life, no one was more mechanical, more deliberate than George Seurat. His work goes from charcoal drawing to study to more complete study to full-size ébauche to the finished painting. I mean, it's a very deliberate kind of process, and our painting was part of the process that led to the Grand Jatte. Now, our painting, these three little boys seated in a field, don't make it into the final version of the painting, but everyone, the Seurat scholars are convinced that's where it belongs. And it's a tiny painting, but we're incredibly proud of it, in part because Seurat dies when he's 31. It's not a long career, and so any Seurat is just a marvelous thing to own. And so Seurat and this artist, his good friend Paul Signac painting in 1885, they both take that while they're decidedly doing something other than Impressionism. I mean, they're building on Impressionism. They both take part in the 1886, the 8th and final Impressionist exhibition that Courtney mentioned during her introduction. And then Paul Gauguin also takes part in that 8th show in 1886. He paints this work in Brittany on his first trip to Brittany in the summer of 1886, maybe a month after that 8th and final Impressionist exhibition closes. And here we have Gauguin, and we just had this painting conserved, and it just looks so awesome. I mean, it had this yellow varnish on it, and it kind of looked like an autumn scene, and now it looks like summer again. And it's just such a good thing. And but it's Gauguin trying to find that next phase in his artistic practice. The Gauguin we know from Tahiti and from Martinique and with his friend Van Gogh in Arles, just maybe a year or two after this work is painted. But at this point, I mean, he's in the final stages of his career as a French Impressionist painter. And he's become a very good Impressionist painter. And so then it's 1889, and the World's Fair takes place in Paris in 1889, and significantly, it brings the world to Paris, and including American collectors, and that really does kind of change everything. The Americans are really introduced to not that the Impressionists had a big role at the 1889 Exposition Universelle. They did not at all. But many American collectors, thanks in large part to Paul Durand-Ruel, whose gallery in New York had been open for 3 years by that time, and Mary Cassatt, who was this tremendous advocate for French artists in the United States. They come for the fair, and they see Impressionism, and they bring Impressionism back with them. And so fast forward 5 years later, and our painting by Camille Pizarro, who's just a wonderful, wonderful artist. By this time, it's 1894, and Impressionism has finally taken hold. By this time, it's an international style. So not only do American collectors come to see the Exposition Universelle, American artists do as well, and they find Impressionism. Scandinavian artists come, they find Impressionism. Italian artists come. and they circulate the gospel of Impressionism to the world. And so by this point, 1894, when Pissarro is painting this, this apple tree in the orchard of where he lives in the village of Erigny, Impressionism is, like I said, it is the dominant aesthetic of its time. By this point, Pissarro is he's 64 years old. So, I mean, he is a mature, he's a very mature artist, but he does still, unlike Monet by 1894, having been completely impoverished, is by now an incredibly rich man. Americans just latched on to Monet and did so with a vengeance. And so by this time, Monet's been able to buy his home in Giverny. Pissarro is the father of 6 children, all of whom decide to become artists like himself, not a lawyer or doctor in the bunch. And so he does struggle almost right up until the end, but he's brilliant. He's the only artist who takes part in all 8 Impressionist shows. And he is a mentor to Gauguin, to Cezanne, to any number of artists who seek his help. And one index of what kind of a person you are, the collected letters of Camille Pissarro are like 6 volumes. People wrote a lot of letters in those days, I'll give you that, but, it's people saved the letters of Camille Pissarro because they had a real affection for the man. It's just a marvelous painting. He's one of my favorites among the Impressionist circle. And then this marvelous thing by Berthe Morisot of a peasant girl seated in a garden amid a group of tulips, a bed of tulips. And I love the way this painting, her wisps of hair rhyme with the blasted tulips, and notice her hands are soiled from working in the soil. Now, by this time, the Impressionists not only are finding some success, they're finding some significant patronage, and the history of Provenance is just kind of an interesting thing in the case of this painting. It was first owned by a collector named Tadamasa Hayashi, who sold Japanese prints and lacquerware and that sort of thing. He was based in Paris, and he may have done some kind of trade with Berthe Morisot for the painting. He owns it for about 10 years when it passes to this man, Théodore de Rey, who wrote the first biography of Edgar Manet and was an early advocate for the Impressionist circle. It stayed in his, and this is his portrait by Whistler, and it stays in his collection until he dies in the 1820s, and it bounces back and forth between Durand-Ruel and his rival Vollard. And when it's purchased by a man named A. Conger Goodyear, who was an American industrialist based in Buffalo, New York, and in New York City. And he was a very successful businessman. But in terms of art history, he's best known because he was the founding chairman of the board of the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And he owns the painting for years and years and years. And when he dies, he bequeaths it not to the Museum of Modern Art, but to the Albright Knox in Buffalo, New York, his hometown. They probably needed it more. Well, the Albright Knox is committed to nothing so much as contemporary art, and so at a certain point in the 1870s or the 1970s, late 70s, maybe early 80s, they sell it, and that's when it enters our collection. So I don't think any painting in our collection has a more interesting provenance or arc of the history of ownership. This was a painting I basically had to sneak out to get to you. It's Renoir's portrait of his son, Jean Renoir, who go on to be one of France's greatest filmmakers, and it's one of the most popular paintings in our collection. By the end of the 20th century, lots of things are changing. The neo-impressionists, the pointillists, begin to expand the vocabulary of their painting. This Maximilian Luce. Luce was in the circle with Seurat and Signac. This is just a marvelous painting. It looks great, and it looks great in the show. Same thing with Henri Edmond Cross. You can see his pointillism turns into a kind of tachiste technique, where the dots turn into little squares, but it's a marvelous painting as well. And then artists like Pierre Bonnard begin to take that impressionist aesthetic and turn it again into something just a bit more modern as well. And this is a painting of his wife Martha in a field near their home in Cannes, and she's picking flowers. But one of the really important works in our collection, one of the really rare works, is this early Henri Matisse from about 1896-97, and it's a painting he makes in Belle-Île. At this point, Matisse is really trying to find his way to who he's going to become, and it really happens in this moment when he's in Belle-Île on the Brittany coast. He's with an Australian artist named Richardson. And the thing about this painting is you look at this hot red stripe running down the side of the boat, and even some of the lavenders up in here. It's better in the painting, of course. He's really finding his way to becoming the great colorist he's going to become. And then this is our very late Pissarro painting, painted in 1903 at the Jetty at Le Havre, and this is one of the last works he ever painted. He paints this in August, and he passes away by 1903. And so while the Dixon is strong in the work of artists painting early in their career, we also have artists working late in their career as well, including this incredible Paul Cézanne landscape, one of the most valuable works in our collection. And this was painted at the very end of his life as well. And without Paul Cézanne, you would never get to Picasso and Braque. And this is a beautiful George Braque still life that's in our collection. And then we also have a smattering of other things. This very expressionistic Khayyam Soutine. So now we're beginning to step this. Working in the 1920s, we're beginning to see just the sheer durability of the Impressionist aesthetic and all the different directions that it can be taken. So you might be asking yourself, how did a place like the Dixon, a little museum in Memphis, Tennessee, how did we wind up with all these things? Well, we owe everything to Hugo and Margaret Dixon. They were our founders. They were incredible collectors. They were some of the most profound cultural philanthropists the city of Memphis has ever known. And they were also advised well by this man, John Rewald, who wrote the first English language history of Impressionism. And we have all the correspondence on virtually every purchase between John Rewald, this brilliant academic, and Mr. and Mrs. Dixon. And it was really John Rewald who urged Mr. Dixon to buy some things when they were a little bit more expensive than he really wanted to pay. So we're eternally grateful to John Rewald. But we've also had incredibly inspired directors. This is our founding director, Michael Milkovich, standing in the foyer of the Dixon residence, looking up the stairs that lead to my office. Well, it wasn't my office at that time, but he made some really brilliant acquisitions for the Dixon to help build this collection, as did his one of his successors, a man named John Buchanan, a young director who took over the Dixon when he was still in his early 30s. He would go on to become the director of the Portland Art Museum in Oregon, and ultimately he passed away very young, just about 5-6 years ago. At that time, he was the director of the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco, and he made some brilliant acquisitions for the Dixon as well, and was responsible for shepherding a an opportunity that the Dixon took in 1995 when we did a partial purchase, partial gift of 26 actually, French Impressionist and modern paintings to the collection. And it was really John's connection to this man, Montgomery Ritchie, who was a Texas rancher we would not have known otherwise, that made that acquisition occur. And lots of the paintings that you'll see in the show come from the Ritchie collection. They were, I mean, the Dixon collection and the Ritchie collection fit like a hand in a glove. There was almost no overlap. The only overlap was Mr. Dixon owned this sweet little Chagall from 1927, and Montgomery Ritchie owned this wonderful Chagall from this incredibly luminous Chagall from 1945. And that those were the only, even though they were both collecting in the very same area, they somehow didn't collect the same things, which was really a very good thing for us. So, and both of these paintings are in the show. The exhibition looks incredible. Courtney and her team have done an amazing job of installing the show. It's smartly arranged, it's beautifully staged, it looks great in your galleries. You can be very proud of it. Come see it often. Tell your friends about it. This is a great moment for the Telfair, and it's also a great moment for the Dixon, and we're very grateful to you. Thank you very much for coming out.